Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together. And today we're going to be continuing our Asteroid Stories series by talking about Rhea and Chariklo, the wives of Saturn and Chiron. And we have done several episodes already talking about different asteroids and how they show up mythically, how their stories show up in people's lives. We've also done an Asteroids 101 episode as well, and all of that's linked down below. So if you have questions about how to look up an asteroid in your chart or what asteroids, how to work with them more technically from an astrological perspective, we'd recommend you go start there and then come back here. Because here we'll be talking about Rhea and Chariklo and the myths associated with them, some of the history associated with them, and how you can interpret them astrologically in a chart. But having some of that background info on how to work with asteroids might be helpful if this is a new concept for you. But
Yeah.
with that, let's just dig in. Hi, Lori. How are you
Hi.
doing?
Yeah, good. So these two are one of my chart examples, my personal examples. And actually Rhea was one of the first asteroids that kind of just sold me on asteroids. Like it was one of those things where I felt like a huge puzzle piece was found when I discovered her and started to read a little bit more into this. Um Kind of like we talked about in Asteroids 101, I think, or the goddesses episode, I don't remember which. But just the fact that there aren't very many feminine archetypes in the planets or in astrology in general, um, I felt really deeply connected to Rhea when I first found her. And she was probably I think Icarus was the first one that I really found and was like, "Oh my god, wow, mind blown." But Rhea was definitely like a close number 2. And it was the first time that it really sent me down the rabbit hole of doing the research and doing the work behind it. So I have Rhea at the exact degree of my sun. It's just a few minutes or seconds off. Um, and when I found that, it made so much sense. When I first got into astrology, I think the thing that I really wanted to focus on or that I felt drawn to were breaking down Saturn cycles. I think the trauma, the patterning, all of the themes of Saturn um, were really, really calling to me. And I have a lot of Saturnian energy in my chart in general. I have my Aquarius stellium, and then my Jupiter's in Libra, and I have the Uranus-Neptune conjunction exact on my descendant in Capricorn. So there is a lot of heavy Saturnian energy in my chart. But I have a very well placed Saturn in Aquarius, and I have a day chart. So Saturn, it almost didn't make sense that I was so drawn to Saturn in a weird way. The more I thought about it, the more I was I wonder where this is really coming from. The only real aspect that my Saturn makes is that it's opposite Chiron and that it's trining Jupiter. And so the more I read about Rhea, the more I started to understand that this is where this was coming from because I just thought that unpacking Saturnian themes for people was so important. And that's what Rhea does. She's Saturn's wife, and we'll get into the Greek mythology in a second here, but she basically her purpose, a big part of her purpose was literally to go around apologizing for her husband and tying up the themes for other people, making them make sense to other people. And she was basically responsible for forcing Saturn to release. And so then on the other side of it, she basically went around apologizing and cleaning up his messes. And so at Demetra's retreat, we were asked to give a little presentation on an asteroid that we felt really drawn to. And instantly I knew I wanted it to be Rhea. It's exactly conjunct my sun in the 8th house in Aquarius, and it's not conjunct Saturn. It's 7-degree sun Rhea versus 19-degree Saturn. So they're not close. But they are in the same sign. And right before I went up to talk, I there was a woman sitting behind us, and she starts telling me about this other story, this asteroid she had found. And I was like, this really resonates too. Like, who are you talking about? And she goes, "Oh, this is Chariklo." And I was like, "Oh, who's that?" Like, tell me more. And so she starts talking, and then she said, "Oh, this is Chiron's wife." And I had spent years of my practice breaking down Saturn and Chiron cycles for people and like really deep diving into the traumas that are left behind by both of these characters. And when she said it was Chiron's wife, I was like, that's important in my chart. Like I instantly knew like, okay, I'm gonna like run to my computer, Google this, like I need to find her. And sure enough, she is just seconds away from my Mars, same degree, which is 6 degrees away from my ascendant. And Cherklo kind of has a very similar energy where, she's the wife of a troublesome problem maker a little bit as well. And not that Chiron did anything nearly like Saturn did. Chiron was a healer, but they were healers together. And then when Chiron couldn't heal himself, Chariklo was always there for that like really supportive energy. And so I just thought it was so funny that like I've created such an identity for myself around unpacking Saturn and Chiron themes for people. And Saturn and Chiron are not super prominent in my chart. Like, besides having a lot of Saturnian energy, like, Saturn is really, like, honestly pretty well placed in my chart. It's not causing a whole lot of harm. And Chiron is alone in my second house, really only making aspect to my Saturn in like a T square to Pluto, basically. Um, and so I was like, I never really understood why breaking these down for other people were so important when really like Mars is the one that's causing me trouble like in my chart.
Yeah.
Um but seeing that both of their wives were really prominent, it brought out this like almost like, Cancer rising, motherly energy in me where it's like, well, I want to help people. I want to be there for people and break down these cycles. And those were just the two outlets that I chose. And just finding their wives so prominent, I was like, oh, well, I'm married to them. Like that. That's why I'm unpacking this for people. So yeah, it was one of those moments where like right before I went on and talked about Rhea, I was like, also, I just found Chariklo. So yeah, we're gonna kind of lump them together into one story today. I wrote down a ton of notes. I have a lot that I want to say about how to interpret both of them. But yeah, let's start with Rhea and the little bit of the Greek mythology story and kind of go from there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I feel like that's one of the more well-known stories
Yeah,
from Greek
for sure.
mythology. Like the main myth that we get to learn about Rhea from is the one where Saturn eats all his children, as
Right.
Demetra at her retreat in December described like little oyster shooters.
Yes.
Where,
As
Saturn
one
had,
does.
yeah, just a little snack, right?
Yeah.
Um, because Saturn had overthrown his father, Uranus, the sky
Mhm.
god, and, castrated his father and became the king of the Titans. And
Right.
then Rhea, is the like great mother goddess, is one way we can understand her. She's also a child of Gaia and Uranus,
Mhm.
an ancient Titan goddess, and the
Yes.
mother
They were
of,
brother and sister, as all of them
yes,
were.
yeah, healthy relationships, right?
Yeah.
Um, and she was the mother of the Olympians, right? She was the mother of Zeus, Hestia, Hades, Poseidon, Demeter, and
Mhm.
who am I missing? There's the sixth one. Um,
Um, you're
best
like
I said
mixing,
Hestia.
yeah,
It's a
you're
weird
mixing up
order.
the Greek and the Roman names a little
I
bit too, I think.
am. Let's just read it from Wikipedia because they'll say the list better.
Yeah.
She's the of the five eldest Olympian gods, Hestia, Demeter, Hera,
Yeah, I was
Poseidon,
gonna
and
say Juno.
Zeus and
Yeah.
Hades. Right. So those are the Greek versions of the names. Um, But Saturn knows that he hears a prophecy that his children will overthrow him. And so every
Mhm.
child that he bears with Rhea, he eats and he consumes. And then finally, when Zeus, the sixth and youngest one, is born, Hera actually can share a screen of a depiction
Yes.
of this. Um, Hera, instead of giving Kronos Zeus, she ends up giving him a rock swaddled as a
As
baby.
a baby.
And he takes it back like an oyster shooter, eats it. And then Rhea shuttles Zeus off to Crete to be raised in secret. And then once, Zeus grows up and is old enough to overthrow his father, he comes and avenges his siblings. And, all of them are released from Kronos or Saturn's belly, and
Mhm.
then that's how the Olympians supersede the Titans, overthrow the Titans, who are then sent to Tartarus to the depths of the underworld. And then we have the Olympian era, and so yeah,
Mhm.
Rhea. That's the main place we get Rhea in mythology. The thing that I
Yeah.
think is really interesting about this myth is, when we think about Saturn energetically as a planet and what it's like to interact with Saturn, it's this condensing and this withholding and this binding. Like Saturn
Yeah.
experiences can really feel like you're withholding things or you're holding them in. Actually personally think of Saturn as a much more feminine energy than masculine because it's much more like going down and internal. And like
Mhm.
that's literally what Saturn does with his children. He resists change and
Yeah.
withholds them, keeps them in, and like won't let them out. And so when you're going through difficult Saturn experiences, that's what it can feel like energetically.
Yeah, and Rhea's name actually translates into flowing, the word flowing.
Mm,
So in some way, Saturn represents like trying to grasp control, but Rhea represents letting go and flowing with what is supposed to happen. But also like almost like making peace with Saturn's energy and the structure and the restriction and like the energies that Saturn kind of forces onto you. Um, I feel like Rhea comes in and like heals them and works with them and flows around them. And she also like is known for her like critical thinking skills. So, she had to lie to Saturn when she sent Zeus away, or Kronos or whatever you want to whatever their names are. Whichever one you want to go with. She basically like has to lie to him in the story, or he would have found out about their son being alive and he would have probably gone after him, right? So instead of like panicking or freezing, I think it's really cool that like her motherly instincts came in and was like, no, I need to protect this child. And so instead of doing anything else about it, she with no hesitation, like wrapped up a rock, gave it to Kronos, was like, here, this is our baby, and then sent Zeus off to go be free. And it like really can represent like a motherly energy of like wanting your children to have freedom and wanting your children to grow up the way that they want to grow up and be the way that they want to be. Um, and like loving them anyway. And I also found that she can represent like the flow of time and generations. And like she emphasizes like motherhood and generational traumas almost
mm.
to some extent, like being the person who ends up unpacking the generational trauma um or the Saturnian traumas.
Yeah, especially since, Saturn is literally the god of time. Kronos is
Right,
the god of time. And so then
right.
Rhea being flow is how do you
Mhm.
flow with time?
Yeah,
Um,
instead of fighting it.
Exactly. And also,
Yeah.
just as a quick aside, because we keep just like
Mhm.
using the Greek and Roman gods
Yeah,
interchangeably.
interchangeably.
So, the way I personally understand this, because a lot, like when Rome conquered Greece, they integrated
Mhm,
a lot of the Greek pantheon into their mythology, which is
mhm.
not to say that Kronos and Saturn are exactly the same god, right? We have different cultural
Sure.
contexts, we have different languages, different peoples. And so it's not that they're like synchronistically exactly the same. But then as
Yeah.
astrologers, when we're talking about the planet Saturn in the sky and all of the archetypes that come with the planet Saturn in the sky, the way that the Greeks made sense of Kronos and the way that the Romans made sense of Saturn all fits into that broader archetype. And then when you're having a
Mhm.
Saturn transit, or like I have Saturn conjunct my moon in my chart, so Saturn kind of always shows up with my sect light, then the energies of all of those myths are going to come through. And same with the asteroid Rhea, the way
Yeah.
that she'd be understood at any point in those myths. And so, not to say that Kronos and Saturn are the same gods, but that they are connected to the same archetype astrologically.
Right. Yeah. Well said.
Thank you.
Um, and also I think with the asteroids in general, it's kind of like up to interpretation.
Hmm.
Obviously the planet's a little less so, but still up for interpretation. It is still a language at the end of the day, but it does have a little bit of like it's been more studied. There's more knowledge, there's more books on it. Whereas characters like Rhea or even Chariklo, who really doesn't have a whole lot that's easily findable on her Greek mythology. Um, it's kind of just an up for interpretation type of thing, like however you feel like it fits or makes sense for you.
Yeah, like part of the story may be really resonant in your life, and part of the story may not be, or maybe none of it. Maybe you don't have a prominent Rhea in your chart, and then she's not too resonant at all for you, but you have a different asteroid that's prominent. So, yeah,
Yeah.
our lives are such a gradient of experiences, and that's what archetypes capture.
Yeah. Well, and like, Rhea is a great mother. So like you can interpret it so many different ways at that. Like the way I saw it playing out was really the fact that I felt very literally drawn to Saturn cycles, right? And
Hmm.
to helping people with their Saturn cycles. Um and literally the repackaging of Saturnian themes and Rhea was responsible for forcing Saturn to release something that he had buried, right? To release the children. And so there's almost an aspect of like, I feel like what I do with clients, where sometimes I do feel like I am responsible for helping people release that baggage or like
Hmm.
get to the bottom of where it's coming from or figure out the awareness behind it almost.
Absolutely. And also to the point that you had brought up earlier that, there's very limited female archetypes or feminine
Yeah.
archetypes, not female. There's very limited feminine archetypes given
Yeah.
to us astrologically, especially from the Hellenistic tradition, right? Demetra George
Yeah.
talks about this a lot in her Asteroid Goddess book of like, you're either the mother, you're the moon, or you're the lover, you're Venus. Like that's what you get to be when you're living
Yeah.
in your feminine energy. And when you bring in the asteroid goddesses, or, right now we're talking about Rhea and Chariklo, when you bring in these other feminine archetypes, you get such a richer gradient of ways that all of us connect to the feminine energy in us, regardless
Right.
of like what our gender or sex is. And like even looking at Rhea as an archetype of motherhood and all of the different ways that one can relate to motherhood, can embody nurturing and caregiving. And how does Rhea's energy show up different than like Demeter's energy, who's also a great mother goddess, right? Demeter and
Yeah, they're both
Ceres
a
and
great
the
mother.
right and the myth of Persephone, but like the types of loss that they both experience are different types of loss, and the way that they deal with that loss and the way that they, show love for their children is different. And so
Yeah.
it just gives a lot more space for us to all like live into our different ways of relating to these sorts of concepts.
Yeah, and I think, Rhea and Chariklo, like it's funny because we're talking about both of them today because they are wives of characters of the planets,
Hmm.
or like another asteroid. But what's funny is that like even though yes, they are that, like at least Rhea and Kronos, like they did not have like a healthy relationship per se. Like it's not like they were the poster child for like the best relationship you could have. Like it wasn't like that. And Chariklo, even when it gets into the myth with Chiron, I feel like we could do a whole episode on Chiron alone, so
Hmm.
we don't even have to talk about him so much. But she like she was also a healer. And, she like did a lot with like body awareness and like herbalism and like understanding um bodily shifts. Almost like it kind of feels like Hierophant and High Priestess vibes to me.
Hmm.
In a weird way. Like the Chiron Chariklo axis kind of energy. So yeah, like I think it's really important to note that like take what resonates and leave what doesn't. Because I really
Hmm.
thought it was cool that like, she is known to repackage Saturnian themes. And that's what I do, right? I repackage Saturn's energy. And like if he represents control and she represents flow, how can you be both? Especially like with my chart, with them both being in the same sign. If we're just looking at Rhea and Saturn, they're both in Aquarius in my eighth house. So, like, even if you take out the fact that it's on my sun, which is the identity or ego, um, or maybe even the relationship with your own father, like that could be an interpretation too. So even just noting that they're in the same sign with the same energy, but they're not making contact, right? They're not within 2 to 3 degrees. They're not even within 10 degrees. So they can't really communicate. And so I feel like that kind of says a lot about that energy as well.
Yeah, and just kind of reiterating, we talk about this in the Asteroids 101 episode, but one reason why Rhea is so prominent for Lori is because she is
Mhm.
conjunct her sun. And for all of us, the
Right.
sun is the point of life and vitality. Like the sun, the moon, and the ascendant are the three points in the chart that have the most to do with you and your personality and your
Right.
sense of self and how you show up in this world. And so when anything is in aspect to those points of life, it's going to show up in your life much
Yeah.
more significantly.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas with Chariklo, like I don't have a prominent Rhea in my chart. She's just floating in Leo, opposing
Hmm.
your Rhea actually in
Oh,
Aquarius, but
love
just
that.
floating up there in my 11th house. But I do have Chariklo conjunct my MC exactly. They're both at
Okay.
3
Wow.
Leo, which is very fitting because I'm an
Mhm.
herbalist and I'm a healer by profession. And so then
Yeah.
you can see how Chariklo's mythology shows up through my MC, which is your public career point, how you're seen in the world. And so
Yeah.
her mythology infuses my public life, but it's not
Yes.
necessarily that Chariklo's showing up prominently in
For
like
you.
every area of my life, more that I am a healer by trade.
Yes. Yeah. And I love that distinction too. Like an asteroid anywhere can be important or feel important or have some sort of like meaning to you. But yes, sun, moon, and rising are going to be the ones where like they are you. So you might in some way be embodying their mythology.
Absolutely.
Um,
This feels like a good place to maybe talk a little bit more about the mythology of Chariklo because we've just been dancing around
yeah. Well,
that.
I was gonna say, I think I only had one more thing I wanted to say about Rhea, and then yeah, we can totally shift over. Um,
Awesome.
but yeah, the last note that I wrote was that Rhea is like fruitfulness.
Mm,
So whether that's like motherhood or whatever that means, but she represents challenges. But in the end, she ended up successful, right? Like it was a challenge that he ate the children, but she waited and then she used her critical thinking skills and she got rid of them. And she like went out of her way to like try to make it so he couldn't eat any more of the children, even if that meant giving up her child temporarily, right? But then all of her children came back. Um, so there is a theme of like, yes, you're going to have challenges, but just like Saturn will reward the hard work, Rhea will also reward the hard work, but almost like more so than Saturn can, if you use your critical thinking skills. So it basically was it can be an area of life where like you might see a lot of challenge, but then end up ultimately like very successful or finding a lot of success
Mhm.
once you understand those themes, which I thought was really great because, my sun in Aquarius is in detriment. So there are a lot of basically things against me that kind of say that like, I shouldn't understand myself maybe, or I should feel like my sun is unresourced, or maybe it's hard to tap into that energy. It's in the eighth house, right? It's literally the
Mhm.
house of like the sun setting. It's blinding people. It's all over the place. But I have so many really strong women in this Greek mythology conjunct my sun. I have Pallas, I have Persephone, I have Rhea, I have Circe, and there's more. Like I have so many asteroids that are within like 2 degrees of my sun, that I feel like have really helped me understand having my sun in detriment, and having moments where like, maybe I should have had questions about ego or whatever, but I've never like wavered because I feel like there are a lot of like strong women in my corner. So
Mhm.
that was something that kind of um that's a lot of energy there, but but yeah, there's a lot of really powerful ones there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what came
Yeah.
up for me with you sharing that too is like the sacrifices that can come with success
Hmm.
too, though, that Rhea
Sure.
was ultimately successful in her children not being eaten by her husband, which is,
Sure.
great. But then also with the children being released from Kronos, that then saw the overthrow of the Titans and,
Hmm.
Kronos being thrown into the depths of hell, which, I mean, honestly, if my husband were eating my children, I'd probably be pretty vindicated to have that happen to him. But like, the
Yeah.
sacrifice of with her children succeeding, then like
Yeah.
her people have now fallen as well. So, there's also contradictions that can come with success, which also feels
Yeah.
very
Totally.
fallen sun,
Yeah.
you know.
That's
So
so fair.
yeah.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
sun and detriment, I guess the sun is in fall in Libra and in detriment
Right,
in
right.
Aquarius, but still like
Yeah, I know what you meant.
the symbol of success and like brightness and brilliance in a
Yeah.
place where it's not as comfortable.
Yeah. In a house that it's not comfortable,
Yeah,
like
I mean,
it
and actually your sun is literally falling to the
right.
horizon.
It
Yeah, in the 8th
literally is.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, quite literally. My son is not doing so well. But it is funny that it's like 12 or so degrees away from Saturn, who is very well placed and,
Mhm.
the ruler of the eighth in the eighth and
Like
that
there's resourcing,
strong,
but your sun
right,
is playing Saturn's game when your sun would rather play
right.
a Leo game.
Yeah, it would.
And then also, just kind of as a little tangent while we're talking about the 8th house,
Yeah.
that the house system comes from Egyptian solar philosophy and the
Mhm.
ancient Egyptians watching the travel of the sun through the sky throughout the
Yeah.
day. And so different houses, a lot of the meanings and significations associated with them can come from that. That's why like the
Yeah.
10th house is a place of like prominence and visibility because when the sun is up in the 10th house, it's like midday,
It's
it's the middle of
literally
the
the top
day.
of the sky, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas the 8th house is, where the sun goes to die. And
Mhm.
actually, in more ancient understandings of the house system, the 7th house, where the sun actually
Mhm.
sets, is also a place of like loss
Death.
and
Yeah.
death and release. But that those significations have held on a lot more with the 8th house now than it have with the 7th house and how
Yeah.
we interpret it, in a modern way. But the 8th house, like that is one reason why the 8th house is associated with death, is associated with inheritance and shared resources
Mhm.
and taxes and things that can come along with death. And then also if
Yeah.
you notice what like when the sun is in the 8th house, that's the point just before sunset. And we've talked about this in other episodes, but the point just before
Yeah.
sunset where the sun becomes so blinding, like if you're driving or something
Yeah.
and the sun's just like right there, and it's the point when the sun starts to cast shadows around you. And so, like, the
Yeah.
fears and paranoias and mental health issues and
Yeah, the
shadows
literal
that show up
shadows,
in the
yeah.
8th house, like, that all comes from solar philosophy. So, just
Yeah.
as a little
And
tangent.
yeah, I think about that all the time, like, whenever I see a chart, that has their sun either in the 12th or the 8th house, this is something I always talk about because it is so prominent for me, but I just love the literal visual of the sun blinding you while you're trying to do your day-to-day tasks, like, right, like you're driving to work in the morning and you're being blinded by the sun. That's the 12th house. And when you're driving
Mhm.
home, you just want to get home. It's been a really long day, you're tired, like you just want to go, but you can't see, right? Like that's the 8th house. Sometimes I think about how I can interpret that into my own personality. Like, am I really loud sometimes? Like, am I like being really bright and blinding, but not seeing the shadow, um, not that you should overthink that or take that as like a anything to like harm your own mental health or anything, but like it can be prominent, it can be there. So like, just having that awareness that like you might not notice your son, like it might be a blind spot for you, that it was doing that. So
Well, and even beyond the sun, just talking about what it's like to
anything, yeah.
have placements in dark houses specifically, which
Right.
are, the second house, the sixth house, the eighth house, and the 12th house are the four
Yes.
houses that can't see the ascendant. There's no line of connection to the ascendant, which is the place of life from the house
Mhm.
system. And like I have a lot of planets in the second and sixth houses, and then Lori has, her crazy eighth house stellium. So Lori and I both are pretty intimate with what it's like to have a lot of dark house placements. And we both have our, sect lights in dark houses as well. So
Yeah.
like prominent planets for us. And a lot of times it can be an experience of feeling like blind spots to yourself for one, like
Hmm.
things that you can feel but you can't quite verbalize or understand, and a lot of
Yeah.
more difficult experiences as well, like the eighth house being a place of paranoia and death and taxes,
Hmm.
and the sixth house being accidents and illnesses, and the 12th house is the house of self-undoing, and these can be
Hmm.
really difficult topics, but like what does it mean to walk through the world, you know being connected to the difficulties that happen in life, right? Because we all
Yeah.
like life suffering is inherent in life, so is joy and pleasure, but so is suffering. And those of us who have more dark house placements might just be a little more familiar with that, or might feel like we're
Hmm.
maybe on a different rhythm than others around us as well. And so,
Yeah.
astrology can be such a helpful tool for just like better, especially those of us with dark house placements where we can't quite see
Hmm.
them, better understanding ourselves and then allowing ourselves to actually just live into who we are. Like you don't need to
Yeah.
make yourself palatable or, easy, or like simplify things down to make other people comfortable. Like if you can understand how your dark house placements play out in your life and you can give yourself compassion and space to actually just embody who you are, that can actually
Yeah.
be a profoundly healing experience, even if, we'd all like rather have things just be easy and flow. It's
Yeah,
not.
well, and I've personally found that, like, all the healers I know have heavy dark house placements,
Hmm.
like, always, because it's almost like, how do you expect to help somebody with their traumas if, like, you don't have trauma? Like, if you
Yeah.
don't have these themes, then, like, what does that mean, And
Hmm.
especially because like for me, I always think about the eighth house, some like also representing like intimacy, like feeling close to people. And how that can be difficult. My Saturn is there. It can be something that feels really restrictive, but it also can be like really empowering when I do feel really close to people. Um and, I was talking to somebody else who has his sun, moon, and Mercury there,
In the
um,
eighth house.
in the 8th house.
Okay.
And we were both just talking about having like your luminaries in the 8th and feeling very like it's impossible to have a shallow conversation with people. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible to, and that can be a lot for people, right? Like talk
Hmm.
about the sun blinding you on your way home from work. Like some people really do just want to talk about the weather. Like some people really, and I noticed that like I shut down if if my family's talking about something that I don't have anything to contribute, or if I don't necessarily like agree or know anything about the topic. um it's hard for me to get into the conversation because I don't feel like I have anything to contribute. So I will shut down. And just like I'll just sit there quietly and then people think I'm angry or like that something intense is going on in my mind and I'm like, "No, my Pisces Venus is just like daydreaming." Like I'm checked out here, but like I'm in here, you know? And so it's like, you can kind of like let another part of the chart come over. But then the second, like, we're here, we're in it, we're like doing the trauma research and we're like talking about the intense themes, it's like, oh, my eighth house is lit up, like the partnerships, like, you know what I mean? So it's like
Absolutely.
understanding like where those things can shine, even though they're hard, but also like that's something I need to work on about myself too. It's like I can't always just shut down because I have nothing to say. Like, because people do think you're angry at them, or like, it does come off
Mhm.
bad or wrong sometimes. So,
Which can
yeah,
be
I
part of
think.
that dark house. Like it's not easy to have dark house placements by any
Right.
means, but
Right.
better understanding them and giving yourself
Yeah.
compassion that like, oh, that might be where that comes from. And also like
Yeah.
you are, like those of us with dark house placements are just called to deal with darker topics quite literally.
Yeah.
And
And we feel
so
really safe and comfortable talking about those darker
mhm.
topics. So that is another aspect of it. And, I have Chiron and Saturn in dark houses. So I think like when it comes to those more traumatic things, like when I meet somebody, I don't care about the shallow stuff. I don't care about their favorite song. I don't care about any of these things. I'm like, no, like tell me your deepest traumas. Like,
Mhm.
and that's why I got into a lot of this work too, because I wanted to unpack where the psyche works and how these things all kind of tie together and why A plus B equals C and like how these things can just kind of come together. Um and I feel like the comparing the dark houses to Saturn and Chiron is like actually very like solid. Like it's a there's
Well,
actually a decent amount.
Saturn rejoices in the 12th house. That's,
Right.
Saturn's joy is in the 12th and Mars's
Right.
joy is in the 6th. And part of the reason
Right.
for that is
The
because then they
malefics,
can't
dark.
screw up with your ascendant because they can't see your ascendant. But then
Right.
also,
Right.
like, I can think of someone very dear to me who has a very strong 12th house Saturn, and like having
Mhm.
a strong Saturn is not necessarily a comfortable experience for you. You might be good at
Sure.
going and being alone to do the hard work that's necessary to build the things you're focused on, but like that might not
Yeah.
be a pleasant experience. But yeah, I would definitely say
Right.
Saturn has a very strong connection to the dark houses, and then Chiron doesn't have a joy, but I could definitely, like, I could see Chiron
Mhm.
being very comfortable in the 6th, for example.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, and I guess kind of leading into that, this is totally a different topic at this point, but like sometimes having a planet in its domicile, like, it's working at full speed. Like sometimes that's scary, right? Like Saturn was in its domicile for like 6 years when it was in Capricorn and Aquarius, and now it's in Pisces, and we're like, oh, it's neutral now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, Saturnian themes aren't hitting us at every direction every 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Like,
thank God for Saturn
um,
and Pisces.
I
Give us a
know.
break.
Literally, and then it moves into Aries, it's gonna be chaos again. And it feels like sometimes having a domicile placement, like it's good on paper, it's good on your chart, but it doesn't always feel good. Whereas
Totally.
like sometimes having like a handicap as Lila calls it sometimes, placement, like my sun in detriment, it makes you work harder on those things, you know? It's like I notice with my son being in Aquarius all the time, like I care about community and people. So I've never necessarily like been introverted at all. I love to surround myself with people because I'm an external processor. Like I don't learn anything when I'm alone too long. I don't feel productive when I'm alone too long. I don't feel like I'm getting anything done. I can be alone. Like it doesn't matter either way. Like I like to live alone. I like to know that my stuff is where I left it. But like I've never felt like I needed alone time to recharge. And I think that's kind of where that Aquarius energy comes in. Like, I just kind of always feel like people recharge me or
hmm
whatever. Like, I will keep going until I get sick. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Should
Yeah.
we talk a
Yeah,
little
move on
bit
to
about
Chariklo.
Chariklo? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, as Lori already mentioned, there's not a lot of information online about
There's
Chariklo. She's
really
not
not.
a very prominent mythic figure. And even
Yeah.
I just read The Song of Achilles by Madison
Mhm.
Miller, or Madeline Miller. I'll put it down in the show notes. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry
I
that
think
I'm
it's
forgetting her
Madeline.
first note. Yeah,
Yeah, it's Madeline. It's
okay.
right there.
But Achilles, Chiron trains all the heroes. And so
Mhm,
Achilles and Patroclus go to Mount Pelion and study with Chiron in the book.
mhm.
And Miller doesn't even mention Chariklo in the book, which is interesting. So she's really not a very prominent
No.
mythic figure, but she is the wife of Chiron, as we've mentioned. And I'm not sure how to pronounce this website. I think it's Theoi. We'll
Mhm.
also link that down in the show notes. It's a great resource for Greek mythology, but I'm just going to read a couple notes of what they have about Chariklo, which is that she was a nymph. She was a nymph on Mount Pelion in northern
Mhm.
Greece. And she was also the foster mother of a lot of the heroes. And so, as I mentioned, the heroes came through Mount Pelion and were trained by Chiron. And so we can look at Chariklo as this like motherly, caring figure of all of the heroes, and that includes Achilles, that includes Asclepius, that includes Jason and Heracles. Um, Also, Chariklo's name means graceful spinner, which I think is
Mhm.
very beautiful. And I am going to share a picture of Chariklo. Let me share my screen so that we can connect with her a little bit more. But this
Yeah.
is um, a wedding procession. And so this is Chariklo right here in the back. And, we have Demeter. We have a number of different mythic characters in here. But what I think is interesting about this picture is you can't even really see the bottom of Chariklo. And when you
Yeah.
just look at Google images of her, like a lot of people do depict her as a centaur, which makes sense because she's married to Chiron. But in the
Yeah.
myths, she is a nymph. And so I guess it's kind of up to interpretation, like what
Yeah.
shape was
She's
she
both
in?
somehow.
Yeah, both and. She's a contradiction in herself.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then just thinking about Chariklo, like Chiron has such an association with healing and with the healing arts. He's a master of herbalism and medicinal plants. He's a surgeon. So you can imagine Chariklo up on Mount Pelion as well, harvesting and gathering the herbs and working with Chiron. Perhaps she was the one who taught him a lot of what he knew about
Mhm.
healing.
Yeah.
Especially when we don't have a lot of myth handed down to us, we can participate. I mean, we can always participate in creating and living out the myth. And honestly, that's what a lot of these episodes are about, is me and Lori talking about how we continue to live out these myths in our lives and how we contribute to the mythic understandings of all of these, ancient beings.
Yeah.
But we can kind of just imagine who Chariklo was, since she hasn't been handed down to us. And I love the idea of her being, someone who would have taught Chiron so much. Is, hopefully most partnerships, your partner
Yeah.
teaches you so much. And also the weaving, and the
Yes.
association as a graceful spinner, I think is really
Spinner.
interesting. Especially, I said I have Chariklo on my MC, and I also love to embroider and to knit, and like fiber
Mhm.
arts are kind of the main type of art that I gravitate towards. And actually,
Yeah.
one of my main commitments in life is to cast webs of healing through participating in regeneration. And how I love the idea of weaving and spinning as a way of healing, and how do you kind of wrap around, and how do you build outwards and build horizontally. If I'm
Yeah.
connected to Lori and I need help, and Lori has people in her community who can help me, then I'm connected with them, right? And those sorts of webs and networks that we have can be profoundly healing. And
Mhm.
so those are the things that come to mind for me when I, reflect on
Yeah.
flow.
Um, so for one, this is before I like really get into what she means, at least in my perspective or my opinion. I thought it was really funny when I was looking at transits. Chariklo was actually at the exact degree of my sun and Rhea when I discovered her. She was
Hmm.
at 7 degrees Aquarius when we were at the retreat in December.
Oh,
So,
we've said this before, but the
mhm,
way
the way they
that
come in.
into our when they make themselves known to us is just
Uh-huh.
so beautiful.
Yeah. And right now, I actually looked right before we did this episode because I was curious to where she was. Because I know she's very slow moving. She is still in Aquarius.
Mm.
But she's at like I think 17 degrees or something right now, which is conjunct my Saturn. So I was like, I love that Chariklo is actually conjunct my Saturn right now. Rhea is actually in Virgo right now, opposite Saturn and Pisces. So they both kind of have some sort of tie,
Mm.
well, one to my personal Saturn, but one to just Saturn. I just thought it was funny that we chose the day that Rhea and Saturn were opposite and that Chariklo was on my Saturn to do this episode.
Wow.
So thought that was cute when I was just doing some research before we started recording. Um, but yeah, so I found that. Um, the biggest thing that I kept coming back to, so Chariklo is the exact degree of my Mars, but it is degrees away from my ascendant. But also Mars is very important in my chart, because I do have a day chart and it is in a mutual reception to my moon, which is it's my chart ruler in my 10th house conjunct my MC. So my MC and my ascendant are they always feel very tied together. They always feel
Mhm.
very related because of that mutual reception, and it just feels like whatever I do in life has to be so deeply like emotionally connected to me. Um and so my story well, what I found over and over about Cherklo in people's interpretations was that she relates to our sense of personal space. So subtle body and like astral travel. She's the bridge between physical and spiritual realms. She was a woman mentor. And she was like really known for weaving the physical and the emotional together, which I think is so funny because Mars, the physical, and my moon, the emotional, in a mutual reception. Um, I mean, that's it right there. And I wrote my book on like understanding the physical body and the emotional body and how they're connected. They're all one thing and how you should learn both. And I come from a fitness background and dance and movement and body awareness is so important to a lot of what I do as well. And so I just thought that was really funny that she has so much tie to the physical and the emotional.
Mm.
And just from a tarot standpoint as well, I pull the Hierophant like every day of my life. When I pull my card of the day, it was actually my card of the day today. But I
I have it
love,
right here
oh
too.
my God. Yeah, it's literally right there. Um, but I do a lot of work with the Hierophant and the High Priestess. And so, it's that physical emotional realm. And I get a lot of symbolism of like keys. I see keys a lot, and there's two keys in the Hierophant card, but Chiron's symbol is actually a key. In
Like the glyph.
the glyph, thank you.
Okay,
Forgot
yeah.
the word glyph. I actually did some research in it the other night to see why, and it actually is an O and a K. It just looks like a key.
Okay.
Um, yeah, it was like the initials of the guy who found him. Um, but I was like, the key seems important, and I always kind of saw Chiron as like a key to unlock the subconscious in some sort of way, like key to like really understanding like where your traumas and patterning come from. And I wrote a whole section in my book about Chiron and like watching Chiron themes play out in people. So then understanding that Chariklo was the exact degree of my Mars, which is on my ascendant, and how I use the physical and the emotional body together as healing practices, as different modalities, and like I try so hard to combine and mix everything I do together because I don't wanna keep them separate. I don't think that body work and astrology and tarot or any of that, like, should be different, and, like, astrology and acro are both, like, flow state things for me, like, they both kind of make me feel very similarly, when I'm learning and, that 8th house obsession with having to know everything. So, yeah, I thought that was really powerful that she was on Mars. She also carries healing powers of grace. So she has a gift of creating and holding sacred safe space for people and facilitating work of the soul. Um, and so I love that too because I've taught fitness classes for 12 years, and I love the idea of like creating and cultivating space, but also like holding sacred spaces for individuals and like
Mhm.
facilitating all of this work. And then yeah, like she has an ability to like witness and see truths behind everything that's happening. So like there was one story, and I'm probably gonna butcher it, but I found it where she like you couldn't lie to her, basically. Like if you lied to her,
Mm.
she could see right through you. And so she developed this energy, this archetype of like you can't lie to her because she knows, right? Like she can see your trauma. And I almost feel like that's me sometimes, like, when I'm sitting down with a client, um, because 'cause they'll even with tarot, like, the amount of times I've had somebody be like, "You don't even know my name, and you just, like, read me to filth," or whatever, and I'm just like, "Well, yeah, but that's what the chart says, or that's what the cards say." Like, I'm not gonna sit here and, like, tell you all the good things and, like, be super nice to you, like, not that I'm mean to anybody, but, like, I'm gonna get to the heart of the problem so that you can become aware of it and work on it, and I I see so much, like, value in that. And so, yeah, that was something I just, like, really related to also, like, that intuitive, like, high priestess energy of, like, "You can't lie to me, I'm gonna know you're lying, like, I'm gonna know the truth, I'm gonna feel it, my gut is gonna tell me you're lying to me, so, like, I don't want you in my life then." You know what I mean? Like it's this like ability to see what's really happening and then being able to like put words to it and create from it and just like weaving the physical and the emotional together I think is so powerful. And I think in some way like Rhea and Chariklo both kind of have that like healing power.
Mhm. Yeah, and, like, what's really sticking out to me from all of that too is the way that Chariklo, like, these words rhyme, but, like, she creates
Mhm.
grace, she holds a lot of
Yeah.
grace, and then she's also a space holder, right? And
Yeah.
so and, like, thinking about Chiron, like, the thing we all know Chiron the most for is being the wounded healer, right? That
Mhm.
Heracles, um wounds his teacher. He wounds Chiron with a weapon that's poisoned with Hydra. I believe it's the blood of the Hydra, but something from the
Yeah,
Hydra that
something like
makes it
that.
so that the wound is like Chiron, this incredibly skillful healer who's married to Chariklo, this also incredibly skillful healer. Like
Mhm.
no one can heal Chiron. And then Chiron actually ends up giving up his immortality so that he can, relieve himself from the suffering of being so wounded. And, what would that have been like that entire experience for Chariklo, right? To be there and to be the one who's holding space for him, who's holding space for this,
Yeah.
incurable pain and suffering. And especially those of us who are healers when you're and I noticed that too. I mean, I have a lot of Jupiter placements, so I'm like, I always just wanna fix everything and make everything better, right? And
Yeah.
but sometimes, like, the healing process, like, usually the healing process, like, you need to really sit with it, and you need to allow it to come through and, being able to hold the complexity of all of the different types of sensations and emotions that we can experience as humans in this incarnation,
Yeah.
it's like there's incredible suffering that can come through that, but like, how lucky are we to be able to be here and experience anything at all, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah.
And allowing ourselves to experience, like the complete array of what it's like to be here and not try to like
Yeah.
numb or bypass it. Although also, like numbing and bypassing can be incredible survival mechanisms as well. And when things are too
Sure,
much, like
sure.
give yourself space for that as well. But, for Chariklo to be the one who's there holding space with Chiron, but then eventually, to lose her husband because he can't heal. Like
Yeah.
he's in so much pain. But like the grace that you would
Yeah.
need to have to be able to like help someone through that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And just like the understanding that like, maybe it's not your fault if somebody can't be healed
Mhm.
also. Like sometimes even the healer needs healing, and learning that as a lesson, I think maybe is more of a Chiron theme. Um but I feel like she can kind of filter into that too a little bit, and just like learning how to hold that space for people. And
Mhm.
yeah, I really like everything you just said.
Mm, thanks. Well,
Mhm.
do we have anything else to say about Rhea or Chariklo or any of our 10 tangents?
Yeah, that was a lot of tangents. um let's see. I don't think so. I definitely feel like we should do an episode on Chiron now, but
Absolutely, especially because 'cause we're talking about the asteroid so much, and, Chiron's the most
yeah.
well-known asteroid, and,
Yeah,
another
well, and
thing
I feel like we kind of avoided Chiron at first because so many people talk about Chiron. Like
literally.
there's so much information out there, but it is very valuable to learn.
Yeah. As Demetra very sassily said in December, that like everyone just immediately embraced Chiron as this like big new
Yeah.
cool thing to work with, but like no one wanted to embrace the asteroid goddesses. And there's a little bit of an interesting gender component there. And you'll notice that a lot of the asteroids we've talked about are either female archetypes or gender queer archetypes like Adonis,
Yeah.
or just a mix of them. But yeah, another thing I'll say here too is a lot of times when you're reading something astrologically, the more confirmations you get about it, the more you can see that something's like really showing up in your life. So, like for
Yeah.
me, I talked about this in the underworld mythology, like the underworld stories episode,
Yeah.
but like my chart ruler is conjunct Pluto. I have Mercury, the psychopomp, conjunct my ascendant. Then I have Adonis and Ceres, who are both gods associated with the underworld, also conjunct my ascendant. So there's four themes right there that I am an embodiment of underworld mythology, that I'm here to, live out the like dreams and guidance of my ancestors and help people through like difficult underworld experiences. And so, if you have a prominent Chiron in your chart and then you also look up Chariklo and you have a prominent Chariklo, and then like maybe you look up some of the heroes or some of the other mythic beings in Chiron stories and they're also prominent, that can be an indication that this like lineage of mythology is something that you're really living out. Or like if you have a prominent Saturn or a lot of, Aquarius or Capricorn placements, and then you look up
Mhm.
Rhea and she's right there. When you see that reiteration of themes, and especially
Yeah.
for those of you who are practicing astrologers, that can be a great thing when you're reading a client's chart to be like, oh, this is probably something that's really important to
Right.
my client because I'm seeing it come through in multiple different
Over and
ways.
over. Well, it was like what Hannah said, it's the spice.
Those flavorings.
The flavorings, the
I
spice.
loved that. Yeah.
I did too. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's super important to find those pieces, and especially because of the fact that all of the planets have a more male archetype. So leaning into as a woman, like what do you want to be? Who do you want to be? You know, I personally have a very masculine chart. I have a lot of very active placements, and most of my chart is like air and my fiery moon. And so sometimes I think about, well, how can I balance that out with the asteroids, and how can I use the goddesses, because the goddesses are all pretty prominent in my chart. And like I said, I have like every time I learn about another, like, really powerful woman in Greek mythology, I'm like, "Oh, that resonates," and then it's, like, on my sun again, or it's on my ascendant again. And yeah, it's like, well, maybe that's why these things keep reiterating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, should we wrap up and share a little bit
Yeah.
about what we have going on? This
That
episode
sounds
will come
great.
out in the middle of April.
Okay.
So do you have anything going on springtime, Lori?
Springtime.
You have
Oh,
a lot
Leo
going
wants.
on.
I have so much going on. Yeah, let's see. So I take over the shop on April
And
1st.
what's the name of the shop again?
It's called the Mindful Nest. So if you're in Cincinnati, definitely stop by. We're doing a bunch of events for our opening week. I think Leo wants to say hi, so here he is.
Oh,
Um, yeah, we have a bunch of events coming up, and I'm being whacked in the face with a tail right now. Um, and yeah, we're gonna have a ton of events through, we have a bunch of stuff already planned through June. So I'm really trying to cultivate the space into more of a resource space. I just ordered a ton of astrology books. They all just came in. So we're gonna have more of a library, slash like it's gonna be more of a bookstore. And then it's gonna be a coffee and plant shop too. So we're gonna have just like space for people to come and read and hang out. We're gonna have like little tarot nights. So yeah, anyone who is in or around Cincinnati, or if you're even just like close to Cincinnati, but you're looking for specific astrology or tarot or like witchy books or resources, I'm hoping to bring in a lot of that. So yeah, first order of books just came. And then otherwise, yeah, we're gonna be traveling a bunch this year, this summer. So I'm super excited to see you again for all of those. And yeah, I guess just my regular offerings and programs that I have and readings and all that stuff.
awesome. Yeah, what a beautiful way for you to use your eighth house stellium to
Yeah.
be taking over and cultivating this community space for,
Be
more
given a shop when Pluto
metaphysical,
moves into my eighth. Yeah.
literally. Yeah, that big change.
So literal.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
And
about you?
I currently, it's March 18th when we're recording this, and I'm currently mourning the end of winter. I was expecting it to snow a lot more this month. And I'm just being, like my entire focus with astrology is to help people connect to their seasonal cyclical natures and like the cycles
Mhm.
of life that flow through us, and using astrology to understand like where are you in a different point in cycle, and understanding like I love Octavia Butler and the way she talks about how God is change, and everything you touch you change, and everything you change changes you, and like how can we be with change, and cyclical seasonal things, right? Like it's also a way that I embody underworld mythology is, the underworld, like death is not the opposite of life. Empire is the opposite of life, and how can
Sure.
we allow for cycles of like beginnings and endings. But then also I really just wanted to like ride powder all month and the seasons are changing and I'm just sad.
Yeah.
um but by the time this comes out, I'm really working on overhauling my offerings and really kind of organizing out what exactly my offerings will be.
Mhm.
I'm planning on rolling out and opening up my bookings for my astrology readings for this spring, and offering an asteroid astrology reading, offering an herbal astrology reading where we can talk about like health and lifestyle practices for folks and look at your astrology and kind of incorporate that with the herbal knowledge I know. Just like a basic, let's look at your birth chart type astrology reading, and then astrology readings that are really topically focused. So if you want to
Yeah.
talk about like advice with a career shift or relationships or, health, which could also merge into the herbal one, but all these different topics that we can get to through the house system. So really rolling out those astrology readings, and then I also
Mhm.
offer astrologically personalized herbal teas, and I'm playing around with different tiers of, blending just basic herbal teas that are like pretty quick and easy and affordable and tasty, and then also offering add-ons where we can look at your astrology, we can look at, chronic pain issues or digestion issues or like really specific health things that you might like support with, and blend a tea for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, all of the stuff to connect with me and Lori is down in the show notes. And as always, if you have any reflections on anything that we've shared, any questions, anything, that you want to talk with us about, like please leave a comment, please respond, wherever you're listening to this.
Yeah.
Conversations with the Planets also has an Instagram, and we would love to
Mhm.
hear from you on there. So yeah, just thanks everyone for listening and for tuning in. We really appreciate getting to share all of this stuff with you guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.